All right, welcome everyone on this first full crawl kind of day. Thank you for coming. Today is a very special event, and we're really delighted to have our guest speaker. Before we get started, I wanted to remind the students to sign up for lightning talks and posters. That deadline is coming up soon, and it's a great experience. So don't you agree, faculty? Great experience to see your work in progress and give you feedback, and we all love it. So don't be shy. Share your work. We'd love to hear about it. Today, I'm really grateful. This is an event honoring our Dr. Pete West, who is a professor here at the University of Washington, former editor of demography, member of the sociology department. We're very grateful for the sociology department's co-sponsorship of this talk. And I'm going to turn the lectern over to Gunnar Almgren, who's going to introduce and reflect on Pete's life and also introduce our speaker along with Charlie Hirschman. Yeah, thank you.
Well, the nice thing about having Charlie here today is that anything I miss about Pete, Charlie's going to cover the ground. But we're going to try to keep our comments to just a few minutes because, well, for those of you who knew and remember Pete, he was all about empirical sociology and substance and not about vainglorious stuff. And he would be irritated with us if we talked too much about him as opposed to the work that Susan has done. Anyway, a couple of things. First off, I want to welcome especially Kristen West, who is Pete's loving spouse of 57 years, also emeritus faculty from Seattle University. So Chris, thank you so much for so we got locked out there. I think the one thing that Pete would permit me to say about him personally, without squirming, is that he was a very skilled amateur soccer player, well into his middle years. So he would want to be remembered for that. Over Pete's career, 40 years in sociology, he published over 70 things. And he was a frequent flyer in demography, AJS, ASR, International Migration Review, and urban sociology. He appeared more than once, in fact, several times in all of these journals. Pete started, many of you probably don't know this, he started his career as a reporter. He was a graduate of the Columbia University's famed School of Journalism. Charlie, you said to me some time ago that you always felt like Pete's work ethic and his inquiring mind were a reflection of his career as a journalist. He kind of set the pace for a lot of us, I think, in terms of productivity. As a graduate student at Wisconsin, Pete partnered with Charlie in founding the journal Concerned Demography, which I think reflects Pete's and Charlie's care for really scholarship that mattered. And I'll leave it to Charlie to reflect on that a bit. I worked with Pete. Well, I was a graduate student under Pete, as several of you have been that are here today. Later, when I got my degree laundered elsewhere and came back to the UW, I collaborated with Pete on a number of studies of mortality regimes in hyper-segregated cities. And what I was struck by in this work is that within the context of, I think, great theoretical and methodological rigor, Pete cared deeply. He saw the human lives and the meanings of the work that we were doing in a very deep way. Pete is also remembered as the penultimate urban sociologist. Dudley Poston emeritus professor from Texas A&M and a lifelong friend of Pete, reflects that Pete was the preeminent empirical human, especially urban ecologist of the generation, testing ecological theories and hypotheses in American cities abroad. And his work continues to be cited and referenced, and it certainly does. As a grad student back in the 1980s, I was in Pete's human ecology seminar, which I have to tell you was a privilege to be in, but it was really, really challenging. And I just remember bins of readings, and including Make Way for Ducklings. We all read that. It was really a tour de force in the theory and methods of human ecology, and especially urban ecology, and really shaped my own career, albeit more in the direction of urban public health. I'll end with two observations. First has to do with Pete's commitment to service. Pete served on multiple committees, both in sociology and across the university, always valued for his work ethic, but his wisdom, perspective, and oftentimes his directness. Pete was acting chair of sociology and also acting director of the CSDE. During times of transition and uncertainty, his colleagues would call on Pete. The other thing I'll mention about that is that, and Charlie, I'll credit this comment to you, that during the times when we were leanest, CSDE was leanest in terms of faculty resources. Pete was really the core and the conscious of both the research and the training aspects of CSDE. And I like to think of Pete as the one that carried the torch during these fraught times. So in many respects, I think that we can credit the scholarship that flourishes today at CSDE as one of Pete's legacies. Nationally, Pete served on the board of directors for PAA. I don't know how many sessions he chaired across the years at PAA, and also the Social Science Historical Society. The final thing that I'll have to say about Pete is this. I honestly believe that he would place the most value on the generations of scholars that he trained and in the work that they have done, both to advance knowledge, but advance the public good. That was what Pete was all about. So before we transition to Susan, I want to, Susan, like me, as a former student of Pete Guest, student who's gone on to have a career that honors the CSDE, the university, Department of Sociology, and I would say Pete in particular. Susan, you're not talking a lot about your work today, but work that really makes a difference. And thank you for accepting our invitation. Charlie, I'm going to turn it over to you because you have just a few precious memories of our dear colleague.
Contrast my usual addresses, I really am going to be brief today because I'm anxious to hear Susan and I don't want to delay things any longer. And I don't want to talk about Pete so much because you're going to hear from Susan about him and his career. But I want to tell you what drew everybody to Pete, including myself, but his colleagues, and he was sort of like a magnet at PAA meetings, was a sense of humor, which doesn't get written down in these kinds of occasions. Pete was not a storyteller that had long lists of jokes that he repeated from time to time, but he saw the absurdity of life, of individuals, of institutions. And you could see when we were in a meeting or a discussion, he would start smiling. Then he'd begin to chuckle. And then finally, he would tell you something that kind of broke everybody up. And that just was it was fun to be with Pete in almost every occasion. And I just want to illustrate this in a couple of ways. One, I would like to read the first few lines of his introductory memo to CSDE. This was when he was appointed the director at a very momentous time in there, and he had all the usual stories about the past greatness, future greatness, and so on. But in one paragraph in, he started, "One of my major goals is to shape up the dress code around here. An executive order will be issued shortly requiring all men to wear white shirts and ties, women to wear gray business suits, and everyone in Nordstrom shoes." Well, you can't help but, like somebody who would joke around like that. As Gunnar mentioned, when we were students, we founded something called concerned demography. And it was a critique of the fact that birth control was being taken over by the right wing of that era, blaming the poor for having too many children. The reasons why people in developing countries were not developing was they had too many children. It was a Republican cause in those days. And anyhow, we were sort of aimed at that and lots of other kinds of things. But Pete had a sense of humor, which I mentioned before, and it just kind of came through in all of his articles. And he wrote probably about 90% of the articles, sort of two-finger typing. And while he was doing it, he would just be laughing to himself the whole time. And one of them, I have all these, by the way, are up on the PAA website, but it was a guide for graduate students to make it in their career. When you go to the PAA meetings, all the stars are going to be there. And of course, you want to ingratiate yourself to the stars. And how do you do it? Okay, number one, you crash not their cocktail parties, but their drunken bashes. And you're drunk yourself and you'll get to know them. The other hand, he said there are all these different interest groups within the PAA, and you have to work each one of them individually. One of them was kind of the AID fertility control model, and the best way to meet them was to wear an IUD around your neck with a chain. And that would really open yourself up to them. He said, of course, there were the path analytic types, and what you want to get is a sandwich board with your new path model on the front and the back, and just kind of wander into any group and you would be there. And it just went on and on and on. He did tell one of the things you want to do at the PA meetings is to avoid all those flashbacks that are talking about concerned demography. They're going to get you nowhere in your career. But anyhow, it just went on, and it was fun to be with Pete. In addition to producing great students like Susan Brown, who I probably shouldn't say this, we want to love all of our children equally, right? All of our graduate students, they're all the same. Well, sometimes. I think Susan was both one of my top favorites, and I know one of Pete's favorites too. He'd be pleased to have her.
Thank you. Oh, nice to see everybody today. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. I want to thank you so much for inviting me. I am very honored to be here today to inaugurate the lecture series on Pete Guest, the guest lectures. And what I wanted to talk about today probably focuses on something a lot of you don't think about, and that's the E in CSDE, that there is an ecology here. And I'm willing to bet there are graduate students here who have worked with CSDE for a long time and not really thought about why there is an E there. And the reason is the tradition of human ecology, which Pete in many ways really embodied. And it was a pleasure to get to know him and all about it. And he was really one of the last great human ecologists in the traditional sense of the term, dating back through the Chicago School. But I'm glad to say that, and as I hope I will show you, the tradition lives on in many other ways. But before I get to that, I do want to talk about Pete a little bit. Gunnar and Charlie had wonderful remarks. Thank you. And they were, absolutely right on target. But Pete was old school, and the New York Times shows it. He was very proud of the fact he was probably one of the last people, he said, to subscribe to the print edition of the New York Times. Now, Frank and I also subscribe to the print edition. Charlie does, so we're not totally alone, but he was very proud of that. By golly, he was reading his New York Times in print. He was a great mentor. And because he was so well-rounded, he was demanding, he was honest, he was kind. Demanding, you know, when I took research design from Pete, he asked for an original research paper every week. And we had to do all of the analyses. We had to do the theory. We had to do the write-up. And if it wasn't tied up with a bow at the end, he sent it back with copious comments. I have no idea how he managed to grade an entire classes, whether in 12 or more graduate students in this class, and give everybody really detailed feedback week after week after week. But he did it. And it was because he cared so much about the structure of writing a research paper. He was really good at that. And that's what he taught us. And he believed in simple methods. I mean, he was perfectly capable of doing something fun, but he believed absolutely that you start out by, you look at the frequencies, you do the crosstabs. And if you came to him with a regression table and you hadn't done the crosstabs, he'd rip it up and tell you to go do the crosstabs. He once told me that you can tell a fool by his tables. So they had to look absolutely right. And he made his points very, very well. I will never forget the lecture he gave on the difference between something being statistically significant and substantially important. He said that, you know, when you're dealing with big sample size, that everything is statistically significant. So what do you want to talk about? You want to deal with something that is substantially important. But what is that? And he said, well, it should be roughly 7 percentage points. And the way that that was determined was that there had been a conference of demographers that had met one year at the Snoqualmie Pass conference, and that they had sat down over drinks and determined that that was the right number. And it had been a very serious conference. And I wrote all this dutifully down. And then at the end of the quarter, when I, newbie to Seattle, decided to go take a road trip over the Snoqualmie Pass, I told my husband, stop, I want to see this conference center where they had this demography conference. And we get to the peak of Snoqualmie Pass, no exit, snowflakes, nothing there. And I realized that Pete has totally made up this entire conference. And there was nothing to it. But now all of my graduate students remember that 7 percentage points make something substantively important. So that was Pete. That was his sense of humor for us. And he said this totally straight face. I believed it. I was so green. But Pete also had a moral compass. He was really intellectually honest. And this makes it hard to characterize his papers, because he will, he'll say, well, this is sort of a weak effect and this side is good and that. It would be very difficult to summarize accurately every single paper of his. I will try at a flyby way to summarize some of them, but understand that because he was very honest about it and demanded good work, that the vagaries of real data mean that he was really good at saying, this is the extent to which something works. He didn't shade his findings in any way. Maybe this was because Pete was a Unitarian. This was something that was really important to him, being a Unitarian. And he said that because Unitarians are probably the most liberal branch of, I won't even say Christianity, because they don't necessarily accept the existence of God, but it's certainly a very liberal denomination. I'm not going to try to define that. But he said he was very proud to be a Unitarian, and told me one day that in true Unitarian fashion, he would not sing a hymn unless he had read the lyrics first to make sure that he agreed with it. So that was Pete. He was also kind. I had a miscarriage when I was a graduate student, and I called Pete up and said, Pete, I'm not going to be in the office today. I lost the baby. And he said, oh my God, where are you? And I said, the UW Medical Center. Pete set a record from Savory Hall down to the UW Medical Center to come visit me. And I really, really long appreciated that, how kind he was to come see me when I was in the hospital. And Pete was a wonderful scholar. I once talked to John Logan about Pete, and John Logan, who was a famous urban sociologist, said that there were many times he had an idea for a paper and then he went to do the lit review and discovered Pete had already done it. So with that, I want to talk about a little bit about Pete's work. Pete, this is a mentoring genealogy that I got from Dudley Poston. I wrote Dudley, who was an old friend of Pete's, when I was giving this lecture, and said, is there anything I should know about Pete that you would like to share? And he sent me back this and said that it was very important to understanding, where Pete came from. And he specifically recommended that I read the work of Leo Schnorr because Schnorr had been so influential in Pete's life, and that he often talked about Schnorr. And what's interesting about Pete is that you can trace this straight back to Robert Park, the pioneer of the Chicago, one of the pioneers of the Chicago School, which was the founder in modern sociology. And they developed this perspective that the social structure and the life of plant and animal communities would develop spatially in cities as a result of competition, and that urban form was mediated by the influence of factors like technological development and competition. But for Pete, the key point of the Chicago School, which is the foundations of sociology, and of the work of Robert Park, was that the past imposes itself on the present, and that you could not look at the life of any locality or all localities without realizing that these places would eventually take on a momentum of their own and work more or less independently, that there would be such a thing that we now call as neighborhood effects. And one of the fundamental statements of the Chicago School, which I put up there, which some of you may have seen many, many times, others for the first time, is that the circles up there, there's the Burgess concentric zone model from 1925, now 100 years old. This was key to understanding Pete's work, as well as that of many other people in human ecology. And it was how the Chicago School viewed the development of a city with a central business district and then areas radiating out from it, each very much with its own kinds of functions. And the poorer areas would be surrounding the central business district. Now, this has been critiqued many, many times, and yet it still has been fundamental to understanding how cities develop. And then moving on to Roderick Mackenzie, who was here at the University of Washington for 10 years. He was really developed human ecology as a field. And Mackenzie tied social life to its particular dimensions through maps, but he also defined human ecology as the study of the spatial and temporal relations of human beings as affected by selective, distributive, and accommodative forces of the environment. So again, it's kind of abstract, but it was crucial to understanding how the collective symbiosis of how the Chicago School worked. Mackenzie died before he could write his magnum opus. It was picked up by his student Amos Hawley, who wrote a book called Human Ecology in 1950. And Hawley argued that human ecology deals with how growing, multiplying beings maintain themselves in a constantly changing but ever restricted environment. For Hawley, the important point for Pete was that he argued that land in a central business district is highly valued. And it's highly valued for its centrality and its access to transport, and then ultimately to residential areas. And then only certain types of businesses are going to be able to afford it. And for Pete, he viewed this as sort of a traditional view. He liked the idea also of, well, what happened to prior uses? How do prior uses of that land matter? And so for him, this was a constant interplay of the sort of theoretical Hawley approach and people who had revised it, and he counted himself among those. And then we move on to Leo Schnorr, who was at Wisconsin and highly influenced Pete. In fact, Pete wrote an article saying, that Schnorr never had a chance to really summarize his life's work, and Pete did it for him. But when Pete was a student at Wisconsin, Schnorr was kind of toward the end of his career, and he was studying the location of high status people, and this was something that Pete picked up on for a lot of his work. What Schnorr is probably the best known for is his work that became known by the mnemonic device POET: population, organization, environment, and technology. And that these 4 factors and their interrelationships were how you could study the human city and human relations. So to Schnorr, Durkheim, he looked at the interrelationship of technology and labor, was a human ecologist before the field ever became delineated. And so he wanted to know how aggregate populations, aggregate being the word here, responded socially and economically to environmental influences, population growth, and technology growth. Shortly after the publication of this book, a lot of the critiques of the Chicago School started piling in, most notably the ecological fallacy, saying that if you are looking at an area, you cannot assume the characteristics of that area apply to everybody in it, which is true. And the Chicago School people said, we were not interested in individual level characteristics. And this is where the notion of the individual within space and the arguments there really started to take off. Now, Pete argued that this POET idea was really too broadly defined to contribute heavily to theorizing in this kind of environment. And you couldn't really construct a theory or test it validly very well. But he did say that, and I quote here, "It seems to me that there are very realistic possibilities for scientific paradigms if we focus on the nature of community organization in units such as neighborhoods, cities, suburbs, and metropolitan areas. At least broadly speaking, their organization may be nicely conceptualized as a product of population, organization, environment, and technological factors." So looking at specific small areas then became really important to him. But the big if here is, if we can do this, because it leaves open the question of, well, how do you define these small areas? And so this started Pete's career constantly in a theme throughout all of his work, looking at context in an ecological sense versus the individual ties and individual in it, and then looking in as part of the evolution of cities. That would really summarize much of his work. And to look at it very specifically, he started out in the 1970s with a series of papers, and this is just some of them, looking at the interplay of suburban age and growth. How old were suburbs? How did they grow? And that's a lot of type. So what I want to point out to you, if you notice, is where they came from, where they landed. Demography, 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 ASR, demography, and AJS. Just in all of these. And how did they do that? I mean, how do you land in the top flight publications with the research things? Because Pete always was asking good questions here. He was asking how family residential settlement was a function of centrality, taking Hawley's views, versus past growth, and he comparing that to the idea of Hal Winsborough from Wisconsin. He was looking at urban growth and population densities, looking again how density affected urban growth in any particular suburb. And he's pitting this traditional view of Hawley against Winsboro and Schnorr, saying the history of the city matters. He did the same thing with retail nucleation. Where are the retail centers? Do you find them in suburbs? Do you find them in central cities? And how it really was a function of the age of the city, whether it was developed in the 1920s, the 50s, or later. He looked at suburban social status, looking at, okay, does a suburb grow because it's getting more people, or does a suburb grow because it's more wealthy people are moving to it? And argued that growth actually helped to make a suburb better because more wealthy people would move in as the suburb grew. And there were plenty of people who took aim at this. It was a long running battle in the 1970s with John Stahura going back and forth. So the suburban social status, again, this is the aging of a central city leading to its decline, or do we continue going on? And he also looked at the work of Ren Farley with a great deal of interest, because Farley had argued that suburbs remained the same over time, which was very much counter to the Chicago school, and discovered that, in fact, there was a lot going on that Farley was in general right, and he supported it. And the thing about Pete is that he had data from the 1920s, the 50s, all the way through 1970. When Pete looked at suburbs, he wasn't looking at longitudinal data that looked at 2 census periods right back to back. He took 50-year increments because this was longitudinal. You couldn't really determine what was going on just in 10 years, perhaps. And he looked at life cycle as well. Is there a lifestyle here? And here he was working with Otis Beverly Duncan's theories as well as his own versus expansion in suburban growth and decline. And finally, he was looking at the persistence of ethnic segregation despite these status changes, and discovered that even when groups were doing pretty much comparably well, they ended up being segregated. He was looking at the old European migrants, and that again was in AJS, and that one was very influential for my work. So what you're seeing is, constantly setting up theoretical juxtapositions with these census data and coming up with really neat questions there. And then in the 1980s, he got back to this question of, okay, well, what is a neighborhood? We're looking at all of this stuff. How do we define what a neighborhood is? What are these local areas? And here he moved to studying Seattle. The Chicago school had Chicago pretty well covered, but he really put Seattle on the map for this. And here he had, 2 papers in ASR and several others as well. I just picked a sampling of them where he started working in earnest with his graduate students, changing locality identification in the metropolis. This was a really clever paper. They went back through 50 years of newspaper ads for where what a neighborhood was when they were selling houses. What neighborhood was it? And for 50 years of real estate ads, copied down what neighborhood it was, what address it was, and how people defined it. And thus could say with some certainty that over 50 years, the definitions of neighborhoods had stayed pretty much the same. And there was a little overlap here and there, but it still worked. And then in other work, he looked at the social organization of local areas in looking at the idea of an urban village, whether social ties remained constant in an urban village, or whether what he called community of limited liability at that point, which was the ties were more or less outside neighborhoods and people used the neighborhood just to live in. And discovered that both of these kinds of conceptions of neighborhoods were in Seattle, but the community of limited liability was considered the nice place to live, where you didn't know all your neighbors. And the urban village where everybody was tight tended to be either the central district the most or Ballard. Those were the strongest ones where he was finding this kind of definition of what the local area was like. And then he looked at how urbanites define their neighborhoods with a survey that he ran with graduate students. How do you define your neighborhood? Open-ended. And whether it was place or whether it was ties, and they got both, and published that on just how that people created the meaning of a neighborhood. And then he took these conceptions of neighborhoods and said, okay, well, how do people solve problems in their neighborhood? And this was his piece in ASR with Salar Pesa, and it's looking at how people solve problems. Is it neighbors, community clubs, or government authorities? And pretty much he discovered it wasn't so much the community clubs, it was the government authorities or the neighborhoods in Seattle that really worked for solving local problems. But this, again, these were really interesting questions trying to get at this basic Chicago school idea of what is a natural area in the city? What is the neighborhood? Is it a realistic way of looking at an aggregate? And then we get to the late 1970s, and Pete had a chance to pick up on and contribute to the literature on social ties. He was really taken with the work of Barry Wellman, who is instrumental in social networks. Wellman in 1979 wrote a really influential paper on the idea of community lost, saved, or liberated. And the idea of community lost, again, this is not a place that's lost, but the ties within the place that are lost, dates back to the Chicago school and disorganization in particular neighborhoods. And it's an area usually poor, usually very heterogeneous in population, where ties are weak. The second kind of community was one that was saved, usually think of as immigrant enclaves, where you have a lot of thick multiplex social ties. And the last one would be liberated, again, similar to his community of limited liability, where social ties tend to be with people outside the community. This was really influential for Pete's work, and he started to mull it over. And he realized after a lot of research that it was far too heuristic, that most ties, in fact, were something in between these models in any given community. And eventually came out with two publications, one calling for one community immediate and another community transformed, looking at ties as a combination of these things. And this was his theoretical contribution to it. But in order to get there, he had to do some empirical work. And that's where this paper of social ties at the neighborhood level came in. And this is one he did with me. So I can talk about that one in some detail back when my name was Susan Wiersbicke. Pete came to me one day and he said, I have an idea for a paper, but it's probably not going to be in any major publication. But I think it's kind of a cool idea. I said, okay, well, let's work on it. And I was his RA, so I didn't really have any option here. I was going to say yes. And he gave me 2 decades worth of general social survey data and said, why analyze this for the question of how often do you socialize with your neighbors and how often do you socialize with people outside of your neighborhood? And we looked at this and discovered that over 2 decades, the proportion of people socializing with their neighbors had gone down, and the proportion of people socializing with others had gone up. But that the proportion socializing with the neighbors had gone down a little bit more than the outside had gone up. But there was also a connection between the two. The people who were more likely to socialize in one area were more likely to socialize in another. But it showed that there was a lot of connection here between these ideas, and that social ties were diminishing in the neighborhood, but at a rather slow rate, and increasing outside the neighborhood. And we wrote this paper up, and Pete sent it off to Urban Affairs Review, and it came back and it was accepted. This was my first paper, and it got an acceptance. And Pete looked at me and said, "Don't get used to that." So, and he was so right. But that paper was published and has gone on to be the paper that was cited the most by Pete, for either Pete or me. I mean, it's like at the top of our citations. So I'm delighted with that paper. It keeps the gift that keeps on giving. And then he went on and he elaborated on it on another paper with Jane Kavere, Ross Matsueda, and Charles Kubrin, looking at neighborhood context and neighboring ties in Seattle. And so he went on to flesh this out. And for that paper, and he discovered that neighborhood contexts weren't really terribly important. I think he was a little disappointed in that, but being the honest scholar, he reported it just that way. So I want to move now to examples of the Chicago school in my own work. And I'll just talk about two different papers here. One of which started with my dissertation and then moved on. And what I did in my dissertation was look at the social ties, primary social ties of immigrants, both inside of and outside of ethnic enclaves. And I focused in this paper on the Mexican origin population, and the data was from Los Angeles. And what I discovered was that indeed over generations, the number of primary ties with non-Mexicans increases. That wasn't certainly what I had anticipated, and indeed I found it. But what I hadn't fully appreciated, what I wanted to test, and was how this related to spatial assimilation. That is to say, whether Mexicans living in Mexican Americans, first and second generation, living in strongly Mexican areas, had ties that were similar to people who were living outside of strongly co-ethnic areas. And indeed, Mexican origin people who were living outside of Mexican areas, more ties, but it mattered how wealthy the area was. So that if you were living in a poor area, the ties were most likely to be to other Mexicans, regardless of whether the area had a lot of Mexicans or not. It was only for people who lived in somewhat wealthier areas that the divergence became clear. And I interpreted this, since the primary ties is, according to Milton Gordon, sort of a structural linchpin of integration or assimilation. One can argue this. I'm not sure Gordon completely had it right, but there's a certain face value here, that the ties are a good way of measuring it. And I wanted to know, okay, well, we use spatial assimilation as proxy. Is it measuring the same thing? And what I came to the conclusion was that it's not exactly the same thing, but there's a lot of overlap. And so that if you are using spatial assimilation measurements as a proxy for social relations, which the Chicago school definitely did, it's not a bad measurement. And indeed, then I went on to do just that and look at the spatial assimilation of Mexican Americans across multiple generations. And this was after I had a job at Irvine. I was working on a project looking at the integration of multiple groups, and Frank was the lead there on that project. We came up with a survey in Los Angeles. It was conducted in 2004. And I was looking at the spatial data because what I had a chance to do, which hadn't been done before, and it's hard to do, is look at the third generation. You don't, in census data, get a third generation now for where people live. And we had it because we asked people where their parents were born and even where their grandparents were born. And what the data were showing, or the way I saw it, is that the spatial integration of Mexican Americans in LA was slow. It didn't happen very fast right away. First generation, certainly not. Second generation, starting to, but it was not really that much different from the first generation of people who had been born in LA. But by the third generation, you saw a huge jump. And in fact, by the third generation, they were almost, not quite, but almost as if they had been randomly distributed throughout the LA area. It was really astonishing by the third generation where people were living and how spatially distributed. But the earlier generations, not so much. And this seemed to be a function of whether the parents had been authorized or not. That legal status really not only kept the parents from moving out, but it also kept their children from moving out. And we had what we thought were decent measures of the legal status of parents. Ultimately, it became this book, which I'm happy to promote here. And this book looks at multiple dimensions of not just spatial, but educational and occupational and many, many different dimensions of the integration of Mexican Americans. So what I call that is delayed spatial assimilation, because it took the Mexican Americans an extra generation in order to really overcome the problems that their parents had faced in the very low status in which they had arrived, and very often unauthorized status. And that very much relates back to what Pete had done, back to what the Chicago School had done. Now, as I said before, Pete was probably one of the last of the great human ecologists who cited the Chicago School in all his work, who came back and tested its hypotheses. Generally, a lot of the work of the Chicago School has been subsumed in other ways now. The critiques of it have had a lot of effect, and people are very happy to dismiss the Chicago School without ever reading it in many cases. But the Chicago School still does live on in many different kinds of work. Probably the best recent work that I found, at least, on it is The Great American City, which is by Robert Sampson. And he did a longitudinal project in Chicago. So that now there are generations of data from the Chicago School and how Chicago has developed. And he looks at the Chicago School, he critiques it, and then says everything that needs to be preserved from its ideas and how they're currently being used. And it's really a magisterial book. I highly recommend it if you are interested in following where the Chicago School has gone. Also, from your own department, Cycles of Segregation, Bryson and Crowder. Fascinating book, not necessarily citing the Chicago School, but grounded in the principles of people picking neighborhoods? How do people choose where they move? This has been a long question in sociology, inadequately answered for a long time, and they really tackled it, looking at how people decide where they move and how their choice sets are limited and how different people in different areas know what choice, have different choice sets. And in that way, it reflected sort of the natural area. And it seemed to me that it really has a lot of the Chicago school ideas embedded in it, even if it doesn't cite them directly. And the last one is a relatively recent book by a colleague of mine at UC Irvine, The Spatial Scale of Crime. And this is John Hipp, and he goes back to the old school Chicago social disorganization arguments and updates them and looks at how neighborhoods differ, on what bases they differ, and what is it about neighborhoods that make the residents choose one of 4 ways of responding to crime. One is, he has a model he calls the Elvin model. One is exit. Second is voice. Think Albert Hirschman here. Do people actually just leave the neighborhood? Do they speak up? And what makes them take voice? And the third part of it is loyalty. What makes them loyal and stay in the neighborhood? And what makes them, and last part of it is neglect. What makes them just sort of forget the neighborhood? And so he is in many ways resuscitating some of the very old Chicago school ideas with a modern take on it. And this, I find it to be a really interesting and provocative book. And so I want to close now with a challenge to the graduate students. One paper I haven't mentioned yet is a paper that was undertaken by Pete's graduate students in the 1980s. It was in AJS, 1984, and it's called Testing the Decline of Community Thesis Neighborhood Organizations in Seattle. And what happened was that while Pete was working on all of these neighborhood definitional studies, Barry Lee, one of his graduate students, ran across a thesis in Suzzallo Library that had been written in 1929 by an uncommonly good master's student named Irene, and I'm forgetting her last name, but it's in the paper. And she had gone to a whole series of neighborhoods in Seattle and looked at the social organizations in neighborhoods in Seattle and what they did and what kind of interplay they had. And it related directly to the project that Pete was working on at that time. And so the graduate students went to some trouble to try to make the data from 1929 comparable to the data that they had then in 1979 and say, look, we have data on neighborhood organizations spanning 50 years. So the first time, it was before there were widespread telephones in houses, before everybody had a car, certainly before television. The neighborhood should have been a much more important factor. And then in 1979, what did it look like? Well, the neighborhood community organizations weren't quite as important as they had been, but they were still there, and they were much more political than they had been before. They existed, they had a narrower focus. And I'm thinking, as I looked at this, in almost 50 years now since that study, we now have the internet. We now have all kinds of neighborhood listservs. We now have people who are constantly walking down the campus with their phones. How has modern technology influenced social organization in the neighborhoods? You got two baselines there. If anybody wants to take up, Pete's mantle, that would be the study to do it, because you've got it right there, and you could do it, and you've got a question here. How has modern technology influenced neighborhood social organizations? And nobody else will have done this yet. So I leave you with that possibility that it would be a really neat study. Thank you.
I have one.
Okay.
Okay. So here in Seattle, we have a number of issues, and I wonder what your thoughts are on them. I'm sure they're similar to those in Southern California. How would Pete be thinking about gentrification, also moving sociology literature, and homelessness as social dimensions of neighborhoods and neighborhood change?
Well, gentrification would be part of this succession, that, finding new uses for an area that it simply hadn't been used before, because he really looked at it as a function. He would say that if the neighborhood is improving, in terms of improving, I put in quotes here because a lot of people would say I'm not so sure about that. It's because the area has an inherent value. I mean, he might go back to Holly on this, but it also would be a function of the age here, and the transportation and the kinds of uses that, it's simply a life cycle function. Homelessness.
I guess what I'm asking, and I'm not coming in, but what I'm thinking is it's sort of modernization kind of approach to social change, like there's some sort of directionality towards something improving and enough. And when you have emerging homelessness, I wonder if that's a signal of something else something else is not being met in this process that we're seeing. Is there something missing in the evolution of social human ecology that he would have pointed to?
Pete focused so much on high status people that this is a hard one to answer.
Yeah.
And that was because it was a very important question at the time in terms of the suburbs. It was sort of a given that at that point that the older suburbs would contain poorer people because of sort of cycling through the housing. And I suppose you could argue that if you don't have enough housing, even lousy housing, people are not going to be able to live there. I don't know that I have a really firm answer on how homelessness would fit into the Chicago school in terms of our understanding it. They would have viewed homelessness as part of social disorganization in a neighborhood. But they wouldn't have really thought of people just being completely priced out of in the way that we are now. If anybody else has something they want to add on that, I mean, I don't know that I have the best answer.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I think I have a question that's kind of similarly asking to kind of imagine urban connections, but most recently, I think all of us are watching the news coming out of Chicago, and I feel like I've seen image after image, video after video of neighborhoods in Chicago, and specifically neighbors standing up for sort of are undocumented or racialized and being targeted by ICE. I'm curious, based on the kinds of questions that were asked about neighborhoods and insights, and then also based on your own research around integration and assimilation. What kinds of questions might what kinds of answers would have been addressed based historically on studying Chicago and neighborhoods? How might they inform the kinds of questions that are coming up now in terms of how people get targeted, who might be standing up for these folks? I just am seeing some connections, and I'm wondering how what we have learned from the past might inform even just the kinds of questions that we're asking today that are paramount importance.
Yeah, I mean, if I had to speculate based on the past research, I would say that it wouldn't be the wealthy neighborhoods that are standing up for the immigrants. It would be more likely working class neighborhoods, not necessarily co-ethnic working class neighborhoods, but ones where you would say these folks are our neighbors. So where you might have these notions of the community, say a lot of multiplex ties within a community would be where people would identify someone else as part of our community and how dare you target. That's probably what I mean, I don't know where in Chicago these neighborhoods are that people are standing up to ICE on. That would be my guess. Yeah, that's a good question.
One of this is the symbolism about a force, in the way in which it provokes you to a more embracing place. There are these masked, violent invaders are claiming your neighbors, are claiming your space. And I just wonder if that isn't how it holds itself.
I definitely think you're right. But, Pete would say, well, would people respond everywhere in Chicago the same way to that? And that's what I'm not sure of.
Thank you so much. And one level is a trip down memory lane for me, the names of all these graduate students that I work with, my memories of them. But at another level, we can talk, of course, about his work, but it would be in the moment, so I remember details, but what I lost was that big picture of the thread all the time, which you presented so beautifully. So I love that new level of insight. So thank you, and thanks to all three of you for doing this and for your kindness.
Well, thank you. One of the things that I couldn't even talk about were some of Pete's other things. I mean, he did a lot of work with other graduate students, Stu Tolnay, Nancy Landale. He had a whole separate line of research that was historical. He had a lot of really strong historical studies. And in fact, he ended up, one of his last pieces was with Mike Hout in the American Economic Review, taking economists to task on how they were analyzing occupational mobility data.
Well, the graduate students get to enjoy over pizza.
Okay,
Thank you very much, Susan.
thank you.